So the United Nations Environmental Program puts out this adaptation gap report every year, and this is from 2022. And just like the health report from Lancet, Health Countdown report, this is the tagline tells you a lot. It says too little, too slow. Climate adaptation failure puts world at risk. So we'll go through some executive summary points and look at some of the data that is shown for how climate adaptation is progressing, how the finance is working, what are the principles that need to be followed to stay on track to avoid non-climate related crises like the Ukrainian war and COVID from derailing the entire process of climate adaptation or even slowing them down unreasonably in terms of how quickly we need to move to keep up with the climate risks. So some of the main points: climate risks are increasing as global warming accelerates. Strong mitigation and adaptation are both key to avoiding hard adaptation limits. So for example, if sea level rises, then you may get a hard limit as to what you can do, as opposed to preparing now and preventing loss of coastlines and lands, even islands disappearing with sea level rise, for example. Adaptation must not be sidelined because of large-scale non-climate and compounding factors like COVID and the geopolitical situations like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, even though there is some argument going on whether it's a Russian invasion or some waltzing in with the military, whatever it is. Global efforts in adaptation planning, financing, and implementation continue to make incremental progress but fail to keep pace with increasing climate risks. This is an important point. More than 8 out of 10 countries now have at least one national adaptation planning instrument, and they are getting better and becoming more inclusive of disadvantaged groups. So climate impacts have not been gender neutral or tribe neutral or in any way equitable, but the adaptation and mitigation must keep in mind climate justice and equity, for example. The adaptation finance gap in developing countries is likely 5 to 10 times greater than current international adaptation finance flows and continues to widen. If you have been following COP27 out of Egypt, loss and damage got negotiated in, but it still remains far from being implemented in an effective way. Current adaptation practice falls woefully short of what is required, but following best practices in adaptation planning and implementation can improve effectiveness. So we'll come and look at what some of these best practices are. Adaptation implementation is increasing but not keeping pace with climate impacts, so risks and impact. Considering interlinkages of adaptation and mitigation action from the outset in planning, finance, and implementation can enhance the core benefits of climate adaptation. We'll look at how these interlinkages actually work. Just in terms of the background, we have seen these when we did the summaries of the assessment report 6 that has come out since 21-22. So this is global surface temperature change increase relative to the period 1850 to 1900. So there is the historical warming with models spreading around it and some uncertainties, and then the future projections based on various scenarios. Remember, we went from representative concentration pathways to shared socioeconomic pathways in AR6. So the best one, of course, remains SSP 1.9. Again, this is a combination of various socioeconomic governance options versus radiative forcing resulting from increased greenhouse gases by the end of this century, by 2100. So without going into these details, you can see we want to stay below 1.5. You have a pathway there. If we go business as usual and don't do anything, we're going to end up here warming at more than almost 5 degrees centigrade. And these are converted into reasons for concern for various systems like unique and threatened systems, extreme weather events, distribution of impacts globally, global aggregate impacts as opposed to local impacts, distributing globally, and large-scale singular events like the regime shift that has just been reported in some part of the Arctic, for example. And these are gradient scales going from undetectable risks and impacts to very high risks and impacts at the outer edges of the warming, but some of them we may hit very early on by even 2 degrees centigrade and so on. So these have to be kept in mind, but you also have to keep in mind the associated confidence limits going from very low to very high depending on which system you are talking about. So this is the historical average temperature increase in 2011 to 2020, which was at 1.09 degrees centigrade. So we are really rushing headlong into the 1.5 limit very quickly, especially considering COP27 didn't accomplish as much as it should, and Saudi Arabia, for example, put a lot of pressure to remove some wordings about reducing fossil fuel consumptions. So these negotiations are important. They must go on, but we are slowly falling behind more and more in terms of the goals and in terms of alleviating the risks that are already here. This is a map of the status of adaptation planning worldwide as of 31 August 2022. So I'm recording this on November 23rd, 2022. So this is very recent, and you can see that except for a few countries, most have a national plan, strategy, law, or policy in place. There are a few that are missing here, like Saudi Arabia, and this must be Iran, countries here in South America as well. And this is obviously something that will continue in terms of global negotiations and bringing everybody along, and peer pressure to get on board with these plans. Information on adaptation finance needs included in developing countries nationally determined contributions or national adaptation plans. So you can see that there are very few countries doing this. Adaptation finance needs included. In some countries, China has not included it. There are many countries which haven't done it yet, but there are quite a few that have done it already, including Mongolia and all these Middle Eastern countries, African countries, and South American countries, and eastern part of New Guinea here, as is that East Timor. Please look up the latest name. Okay. The report always also provides a sense of progress report. So this is looking at number of projects from 2006 to 2022 with some projections for 2022 here. Of the scales of adaptation projects. So number of new adaptation projects per start year, size, and combined annual funding value under Adaptation Fund, Green Climate Fund, and the Least Developed Countries Fund and Special Climate Change Fund of the Global Environmental Facility GEF as of 31st August 2022. So you can see the scales have increased and the amounts have gone up and down, but you have to add the magnitudes here. So these are 0.5 to 10 million US dollars, 10 to 25 in this green color, and light green color is in the 25 to 50 million dollar range, and there are some lighter greens which are greater than 50 million range here. So the number of projects and the total finance in general shows some good trend, but total value of projects is experienced a rise, a little dip, maybe related to various socio geopolitical and COVID type issues, and of course the crash here because of the COVID as well. So even the extrapolated values do not keep up the pace needed in terms of adaptation. This is an architecture of risk reduction, so it's not always easy to quantify the reduction in risk accomplished by adaptation projects that are implemented or being planned, strategized, funded, and so on. So this is also including principles, actions, and outcomes that can be used as a basis for assessing actual or likely adaptation effectiveness. So we'll look at an example or two along this effectiveness criteria. So the good practices principles we'll look at again: inclusion, co-production, transparency, equitability, devolved and adaptive governance, and so on. So we'll come back to that. Actions should include mitigation and adaptation actions that modify hazards directly, adaptation action to reduce exposure to hazards, and action on structural drivers of vulnerability like power inequality, marginalization, politics, and so on. So if you think of risk in the IPCC framework as hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, you want adaptation to address all of those. And then the outcomes should look at hazards, exposure, and vulnerability reductions, and enhanced resilience and reduced risk, with improved human and ecosystem well-being, reduced losses and damages, additional impacts due to climate change, contribution to duration, intensity, frequency of extreme events, area covered, and so on and so forth, compared with the no adaptation baseline. Okay, this is a schematic showing the aligning of climate change mitigation and adaptation action, differences, synergies, and trade-offs. Okay, so here are the synergies. Under the rubric, you have adaptation solutions that reduce exposure to climate hazards while simultaneously sequestering carbon. For example, mangrove restoration that reduces coastal hazards, increases urban green spaces to reduce urban heat island effects, and so on. And mitigation solutions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions or enhance carbon sequestration while simultaneously reducing exposure to climate hazards, like reforestation that reduces landslide hazard, hydroelectric power that reduces downstream flood and drought risks. Okay, and the differences: different knowledge and information required to inform policy making, distinct stakeholders, and distinct distributional impacts. So global mitigation versus local adaptation benefits have to be considered. So you have to drive towards adaptation and mitigation, including all these sectors. So the sectors I'm not going to list here, but the report looks at them, like agriculture, infrastructure, health, food production systems, logistics, etc., buildings, and so on. So there are trade-offs involved in mitigation and adaptation, of course. Mitigation actions that increase exposure and vulnerability to climate change have to be kept in mind, like hydropower investments in hazard-prone areas. Adaptation actions that undermine mitigation efforts, like air conditioning investment. So if there is warming, air conditioning is easy and best adaptation, but air conditioning right now also increases greenhouse gases and climate change. So that's not a good adaptation, for example. Okay. As a summary, despite positive signs that we must do much more towards net zero climate resilient development, accelerating global warming is increasing climate impacts and puts countries at serious risk of experiencing adaptation limits and intolerable losses and damages. Avoiding hard adaptation limits requires the urgent scaling up of mitigation and for adaptation to go beyond incremental change. Transformational adaptation is a word that's used often, but oftentimes it's not always clear what that means and how you avoid maladaptation when you try these big transformational changes. Although efforts in adaptation planning and finance implementation are continuing to increase, significant acceleration and shifts in scale are needed to avoid the adaptation gaps from widening further. Where we need to be versus where we are have to be closed very rapidly. Current adaptation practice falls woefully short of adaptation of what is required, and following best practices in adaptation planning and implementation is needed to improve effectiveness. So I'm rereading these from the beginning just to re-emphasize. Despite the potential for substantial co-benefits to be realized when considering adaptation mitigation interlinkages from the outset, more must be done to overcome silos and avoid potential trade-offs. So this is silos can work in many ways. Different ministries in each country not talking to each other, for example, energy, health, agriculture, water, transportation, and so on. So those silos have to be avoided. Large-scale non-climate and compounding factors continue to jeopardize adaptation investments and outcomes, and strong political will is needed for the international climate community to build on the Glasgow Climate Pact agreed during COP26 in 2021 and to deepen collective commitments on net zero, adaptation, climate finance, and loss and damage. But these are struggles that are going on right now. This is just the progress in global adaptation planning since 2000. So first plan, strategy, and or law and policy, number of countries has grown very nicely. Second plan, strategy, law or policy have also grown by about 50% there. Third plan, strategy, law and policy growing. And fourth plan, strategy and law, many countries have done it, but still long way to go, of course. And you can look at potential developing countries' adaptation finance needs for the 2021 to 2030 period by region. I won't read the details, but such numbers exist, and these must become part of the overall negotiation, overall planetary resilience, risk reduction, and distribution of global impacts and global aggregation of impacts and so on and so forth. So you can see that annual adaptation finance needs in US dollars at 2020 in billions is 2022 $202 billion as a median, with min-max ranging from 79 to $612 billion. Annual adaptation finance needs as a percentage of GDP is important to look at, which is median at 0.6 and ranging from 0.424 to 1.80. So these numbers may look big, but it's important to look at them as percentage of GDPs so that you can have a sense of what is the commitment you are making in terms of the total GDP you are working with. So just looking at absolute numbers and saying 202 billion is too high is not going to be very effective when you can see that it's only 0.6% of the GDP. That much has to be accomplished. Finally, summary of 5 illustrative cases assessed in section 5.2. I won't go into the details, but climate risks like heat waves and heat and riverine inland floods are looked at. Adaptations have included things like heat action, flood risk management, etc. And then you look at effectiveness outcomes in terms of positive, negative, neutral, mixed, and insufficient evidence, and look at for vulnerable people, for at-risk ecosystems, goals of equity, gender, injustice, and over time how they add up, and mitigation. So there are context specificities and adaptation adequacy and limits that have been evaluated. You can look at those, and there are examples of these for the other part of the global south as well, looking at climate smart agriculture in West Africa, infrastructural adaptation in small island developing states, and planned relocation in South and Southeast Asia. Okay, keep these in mind as we look at the synthesis of principles for best adaptation practices, which are critical to keep in mind to make them effective and to bring out the most of the co-benefits associated with adaptations. Genuine inclusion of stakeholders, local communities, women, and marginalized groups like indigenous peoples into decision making, and co-development of adaptation planning and implementation to reflect differing values, perspectives, and interests, and produce equitable, fair, and just adaptation outcomes. They have to be need-based, they have to include stakeholders, co-produced, and effectiveness and social impacts have to be looked at. Transparency, accountability, and predictability of support and integration of adaptation into national development priorities, strategies, and the Sustainable Development Goals. So there are 17 goals, and each have their own goals, and they all have to be kind of dealt with holistically in this context of adaptation as well. Flexible programming and adaptive management of implementation to consider feedback and learnings and to enhance efficiencies. So adaptive management and learning by doing is what adaptation is all about. So those flexible plans have to be built into the way they are implemented and funded. Investment in local capabilities, capacity building, and democratic governance structures in support of climate risk management and empowerment for long-term sustainability. Okay, it's not a one-off thing. It has to have long-term life in terms of protecting people, reducing vulnerabilities and risks. Consideration of future risks, including climate trajectories and uncertainties to minimize unintended consequences and maladaptation while enhancing adaptation ambitions. So big investments and big plans can lead to maladaptations, and there are some examples of those which tend to be region specific, so we won't go into them here. But overall, an eye is always needed to be kept on maladaptations as well. Integration of local, traditional, indigenous, and scientific knowledge into design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation to enhance buy-in and ownership. So if you go and start handing out things like solar stoves in places where people are very used to a smoky flavor, cooking on fire, etc., etc., adaptation and buy-in and ownership can become very difficult. So these are very important important issues to be kept in mind. Tackling inequalities and structural drivers of vulnerability in addition to reducing exposure and or vulnerabilities to climate hazards to embark on climate resilient development pathways. So when you go in and try to help, let's say, urban centers, urban cities to deal with climate change, you have socioeconomic groups, slums, rich people, and shared spaces and so on. So here inequalities and structural drivers of vulnerabilities have to reduce vulnerability and exposure with these adaptation goals. Okay, so obviously I'm giving you a very brief exposure to the report, but the report is freely available. Should definitely go in and look at it. It has some 8 chapters with a large number of citations in each chapter, which have very critical details of what we looked at here so briefly. But use this as a starting place, and I hope it helps. Okay.